The GameCube era is fondly remembered by Resident Evil fans like myself. It gave birth to games like Resident Evil 1 Remake, which to this day is seen by a bunch of people as classic Resident Evil perfected, a true classic that I think is still the best remake ever made. And it also gave birth to Resident Evil 4, the game that is fondly remembered as changing everything up for the series, and seen as one of the most innovative games of the time. But there's also another game that came out during that GameCube era, one that is not as well remembered as those two. I'm talking about Resident Evil 0. It only came out a mere 6 months after Resident Evil 1 Remake. Here in the UK it came out in September of 2002, and then in March 2003 we already had Resident Evil 0. Back in the day, when I was actually playing Resident Evil 1 Remake, I genuinely was looking more forward to Resident Evil 0, and that is because it was being marketed as a brand new Resident Evil experience. No matter how good Resident Evil 1 Remake was back in the day, and trust me, I knew it was amazing, I actually thought Resident Evil 0 was going to be even better, because why wouldn't you after playing Resident Evil 1 Remake? I could not tell you how excited I was for Resident Evil 0 back in the day. As a lifelong Resident Evil fan, I do find Resident Evil 0 a pretty subpar, mediocre experience at best when it comes to the other games that were around at the time as well. So I'm going to go over in this video some of the reasons why I think that is. And please just try and remember though, that every video game is subjective when it comes to opinions on the internet, of course. But maybe you played this game first in the series or something, which might lean towards you liking the game more, but I'm just here to explain the reasons why I think the game is not as fondly remembered as some of the other classics among the series. One of the things that I dislike the most about Resident Evil 0 is just overall how you're supposed to go about playing the game in general. I would usually coin this phrase as something like fundamentals. That term gets used a lot in fighting games for like legacy skill that gets passed down from game to game for players. And I also think this term can be used for single player games as well. Games like Resident Evil, which actually teach you how to play from the first game, second game, third game, and so on, and can carry forward into other games later down in the franchise, and you kind of have a general idea of how the games are supposed to be played. Resident Evil 0 kind of feels like it comes along and says screw it to everything you learned in previous Resident Evils, we're kind of going to shake it up on you now. It's going to make you control two characters in this game, Billy and Rebecca, which sounds cool right off the bat. You're controlling two characters, and I'm somebody who absolutely loves fixed camera angles and tank controls, but I will say that controlling two characters in this environment is a lot more tedious than you think it would actually be. So you've got two characters to play in this game. On top of that, that means you've got two inventory systems to manage in this game. And one of the things I hate about it is you only get 6 inventory slots per character. And basically a shotgun in this game takes up like 2 spaces, and then the ammo also takes up another space. That's 3 out of 6 spaces right there for one weapon on one character. There's 2 shotguns in this game, so you can kind of like see where this is going. There's also a grenade launcher in the game which takes up 2 spaces, and then the ammo would take up a 3rd space. Never mind different types of ammo also taking up other spaces. You've also got to hold your healing items as well. And the way Capcom went about balancing this was they took away the item box in this game, which is something that was in every other Resident Evil up until this point. The way the item box works is you could take any item, any key item, health item, ammo, and put it in this box, and it would appear in the similar box later on in the mansions or wherever it is, and you could basically like pass items around between rooms. That's essentially how it works, but that's not in this game. The way they went about it was, oh, we'll get rid of the item box and we'll just let players drop things on the floor, which is a more logical approach to the situation, but it makes it a lot more tedious than using a box. A good way to generally go about playing Resident Evil is to take specific paths in the mansions or police stations, whatever Resident Evil it is that you're playing, wipe out those enemies so it's a safe part for you to traverse multiple times. It's harder to do that in 0 because you might come across certain items that you need to pick up later on, and that means that you've got a full inventory, so you have to drop something on the floor there, thus making you risk having to go back through rooms that are otherwise full of zombies that you've not got enough ammo to kill in the first place because your ammo's back in another part of the mansion that you have to drop on the floor. Do you see the problem that this kind of creates? That's the problem genuinely that Resident Evil 0 has, and there is a lot of nasty enemies in this game. All the while this is going on, you've actually got a terrible AI, in my opinion, controlling your secondary partner that you're not using. You can choose to have them on attack mode or idle mode, and if they're on attack mode, they will clearly attack the zombies or anything that's in the room. But in doing so, they're wasting so much of your ammo that you'd probably rather save for bosses, and they honestly don't care. Sometimes they will be missing, especially if they've got something like Molotov cocktails and they'll be throwing them all over the floor. It's genuinely terrible. I don't think the AI is programmed too well in this game, which then essentially makes you just controlling one character, because you'll keep them on idle mode to save your ammo. It's honestly one of the most frustrating things while playing this game. I don't know what they were thinking about it. It's one of the reasons why I've always said that people should probably just play this game on normal mode or even easy mode if they're gonna play the game. Normal mode's no big deal, but usually when you're playing a hard mode in Resident Evil, you always want to play the hard modes, you know, but I genuinely think, as someone who has played hard mode on Zero multiple times, that it is the hardest Resident Evil in the franchise, one of them as far as I'm concerned, definitely the old series, because all the bad mechanics of the game are just even more tedious on hard mode. It's so much more tedious than it needs to be. Lately I've been playing the game on easy mode just to try and have a good time with the game and try and see if there's something else there that I can enjoy in it. I do have to put in here that back in 2015, when they made a HD remaster of Resident Evil 0, that I cannot believe that Capcom didn't see the idea of putting in an online mode for this game. As far as I'm concerned, this game just screams cooperative play for a classic Resident Evil title. I think it would enhance the game in so many ways if there was an online function for this game, but Capcom didn't think about doing it. I think that is a seriously missed opportunity for the life of Resident Evil 0. I think if we had that, we would probably look on this game a lot differently today as far as the gameplay is concerned, playing with other people. Another thing that kind of irks me about the general gameplay when controlling the characters is that you kind of do want to control Billy over Rebecca just purely because he's got more health than Rebecca. She can honestly be put on orange caution after like one hit sometimes, it feels like. She really wasn't balanced too well with this game. It's because it was kind of like back in the day when Capcom were kind of like more, okay, the guy has more health than the girl, and I think they took it a little bit more to the extreme when it came to Resident Evil 0, and Rebecca honestly gets screwed over in this game when it comes to health points. She can't even like turn valves in the game. You kind of have to have Billy do stuff like that from a story standpoint while Rebecca kind of watches on because she's not got enough strength to do it. They done things like this in games like Fatal Frame later on. It kind of makes sense in some areas because obviously like girls be a wee bit more weaker than certain guys, especially like Rebecca was smaller than Billy. So I understand it from a story standpoint, but I really don't like the health aspect. I've never really dug that because I much prefer playing Rebecca in this game over Billy, and I'll still use her over Billy most of the time just because I like her so much. But it irks me. I was never a big fan of the enemies in Resident Evil 0, I'll be brutally honest. I don't even know the proper names for the enemies in this game other than the ones that appeared in similar Resident Evils, obviously like the hunters, the spiders. The hunters are really hard to deal with in this game. You can actually get like comboed to death by some enemies in this game, and that is because for some weird reason in Resident Evil 0, the hit stun in this game can last like seconds. Seriously, in Resident Evil 1 Remake there was always a bit of a bad hit stun, but it's nowhere near as bad as 0. It's almost like they doubled the frames in 0 for like recovery if you get hit. She'll be like holding her leg for like 3 seconds until she get back up. You can actually get hit again by enemies while you're in recovery mode in this game, and I think it's a wee bit imbalanced personally. I remember once I was genuinely salty because I got comboed to death by 2 hunters and there was absolutely nothing I could do about it. I couldn't even shoot anywhere in between the hits. There's also a lot more creature type enemies in this game that I genuinely don't like that much. The monkeys that are in the game are genuinely annoying. The plague crawlers are in it. There's not as many zombies in this game. It's more about the creature aspect in this one. And I guess that's down to personal preference, but I have never been a fan of it. I'm also just not a fan of the bosses in this game. The giant scorpion is one of the bosses. The giant bat, the centipede in the games. Honestly, I never felt like they really fit with the game too well. I just don't like them. I've never liked them. I think what they tried to do was create, like, because in Resident Evil 1, Yawn is such a big part of that game as a boss, they thought it would be cool to have, like, multiple kinds of bosses like that. But I think what it ends up doing is taken away from the fact that there is, like, a giant scorpion in the game, because next we fight a giant centipede, then we fight a giant bat, and seriously, don't even get me started on, like, the last boss, which kind of feels completely imbalanced as far as like a boss fight goes. I think it could be the worst boss fight in the series as far as I'm concerned, fighting the Queen Leech. Some of the enemy designs I really like are just the bog standard zombies in this game though. They're far superior over Remake, I think. Seriously, if I have to praise the game there, it's just that the zombie designs look amazing. The level of detail in the zombies in this game are fantastic. It's just a shame that there's like that many of them and the game doesn't focus on it too much, when I think the game would have been better if it did just focus on that aspect. But it focuses more on the creature aspect, like I was saying, so it takes away from the zombies. You kind of just forget all about them eventually because you're being hunted down by a bunch of apes and cockroaches, man. Because I'm on the subject of praising the game a little bit, there is another couple of things I absolutely love about Zero, which is one of the reasons I actually come back and replay the game like maybe a couple of times a year. The graphics are stunning. The presentation of the game is beautiful, and sometimes I can take all the stuff I hate about Zero out of the way and just focus on that and get somewhat of an enjoyable playthrough. The backgrounds look so much better than even Resident Evil 1 Remake in that angle. It's kind of crazy to think the games are only like 6 months apart and such high resolution pictures were used for the backgrounds in Resident Evil 0 as opposed to Resident Evil 1 Remake. The atmosphere looks absolutely amazing in this game thanks to those graphics as well, and I'll say this, I think my favourite thing about Resident Evil 0 is when they take us to the underground lab that's in Resident Evil 2. Is it not crazy that we actually get to see a little bit of history there for what would have been the real Resident Evil 2 remake? Every time I come into contact with those areas when I'm replaying the game, I just literally stand there for like 10-15 minutes and soak it all in. I just wish we could see some of the other areas in the underground lab, but nonetheless, I think it's part of history and we can always look at it and say, what if we actually got the remake for 2 and 3 back then? How good would they have been? And I'm still a firm believer to this day that I genuinely think they would have been just as good, if not better, than RE1 Remake. When it comes to the story of Resident Evil 0, I'm a firm believer that I don't think Resident Evil 1 needed a prequel story. I think it kind of takes away from the mansion incident as a standalone tale, that a virus broke out and caused all the workers in the mansion to turn into mindless zombies, and the STARS were there to investigate. And I think it takes away from that a little bit, because what it does is it says that there was something that happened before it, and it's got wee supernatural aspects to it as well, like the Queen Leech that reanimates the body of Marcus and turns him into like a younger version of himself and stuff. And I just don't like it. I just don't feel like it fits with the original Resident Evil 1 story in any way. I don't really think they sat down and thought about the ins and outs of it really, which is quite a shame to be honest. It kind of feels like it would be more suited towards something today, like with the vampires that they do in Resident Evil Village. And maybe that would go on to make a good remake if they could retell this story somehow and make it fit. But I do think it takes away from the original Resident Evil 1 story. It's nice to see the Bravo team. It's just a shame that they couldn't have come up with a better story for those guys, because I would have liked to have seen what else Enrico was up to for one. I do like seeing what Rebecca is up to. It's also nice to see Albert Wesker and William Birkin and seeing what they were up to prior to the events of Resident Evil 1 as well. But it all kind of feels a bit pointless to me, like the story didn't really need to be told. And that brings me to one of the biggest criticisms about Resident Evil Zero's story to this day that is still being talked about. And that is, why is Rebecca the way she is in Resident Evil 1 Remake when 24 hours before in Zero she was killing tyrants by herself? She's got all that experience from Resident Evil 0 that was not brung forward into Resident Evil 1 Remake. They just kind of choose to make her forget that anything happened. I don't know if it was ever explained like amnesia or something like that. I don't think it was. She just doesn't acknowledge anything that happened in Zero. And in the end of Zero, she's literally heading towards the Spencer Mansion. So, for some reason, in Resident Evil 1 Remake, they chose, as far as I'm concerned, it was a conscious decision not to include anything from Resident Evil 0's story. Let's just take a second to actually think about why they might have went about this. And I personally believe that it's a good thing that they left out anything Resident Evil 0 related in the RE1 remake. And the reason I say this is because, like I said, I feel like the story is actually pointless and doesn't add much to Resident Evil 1. And we know the games were only 6 months apart though. It made logical sense to probably connect the games in some way. But ask yourselves, how would they have actually went about it? Did you want them referencing everything in Resident Evil 0 and Resident Evil 1 Remake? It's widely accepted that Resident Evil 1 Remake is still, to this day, 20 odd years later, considered the best remake of any video game. Could you honestly say that if it had aspects of Resident Evil 0's story in it, it might have been as fondly remembered? What if it only heard it? We can't ever really answer that question, but you never know. I'm a firm believer nowadays that it would have been pretty cool to have like a more experienced Rebecca in RE1 Remake, absolutely, because it kind of makes no sense from a story standpoint. But I don't really count Zero as canon in my head because it feels like some sort of made up story from like the B team of Resident Evil back in the day as a side game. And that's fine. But I do think we might have no remembered RE1 Remake as fondly if they did incorporate aspects of Zero in one story now. It's such a shame that Resident Evil 0 is the only game that really has Rebecca as a main character in it that you control. It kind of feels like Capcom doesn't really have faith in her as being a main character. I hope I look back on this video and be wrong about it, but you think she would have been in a new game by now. I absolutely love Rebecca. She is one of my favourite things about 0, and when I ever do replay, I'm always playing her. I hope one day as well Capcom actually release the N64 prototype for this game if there's some sort of working version of it. That always looked sick to play, and it genuinely would be nice to go back and play it in some sort of Resident Evil 2 graphics. But nonetheless, guys, those are my opinions about Resident Evil 0. Whether you like them or don't like them, let me know. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.